Even with something as simple as labeling, there are always some exceptions to the rules. Some of the most common waste with these exceptions and alternative standards for labeling and other requirements include oil and fuel filters, universal wastes, empty containers, launderable rags, and used oil. For containers or tanks that hold used oil, there is an additional labeling requirement. The words used oil need to be clearly marked on the container or tank. This includes any transfer buckets. Some facilities may store their used oil in underground tanks, and the labeling must be marked on the fill pipe that is used to transfer the used oil into that underground tank. Used oil and gasoline filters aren't required to meet the full labeling requirements discussed previously for hazardous wastes. Any containers that store drained used oil and or gasoline filters may be labeled with their contents. So for example, drained used oil filters and drained used oil and gasoline filters. You can see those labels on the slide itself. And they must be marked with the accumulation start date. There are a few things to note regarding drained used oil filters. Used oil filters may be sent for recycling by properly draining the filter of all used oil and shipped to a recycling facility on a bill of lading. If the oil filters aren't properly drained, they must be managed as fully regulated hazardous waste. Also, the state of California has advised that gravity draining alone is no longer acceptable as a method of draining used oil filters, and they must be punctured, crushed, opened, or otherwise manipulated before draining in order to evacuate all of the used oil. Lastly, note that the alternative management standards for drained used oil filters only applies to the metal cased oil filters because the metal itself can be recycled. Paper or cartridge style oil filters that do not have a metal casing are not eligible for these alternative management standards and must be managed as a hazardous waste. Here we have a slide. You can see the alerts that the state of California sent, clarifying the proper methods of draining used oil filters that are sent for materials recycling. For more information regarding this topic, you can visit the Department of Toxic Substances Control Board's website at dtsc.ca.gov. This slide shows some options and tools that can be used for the crushing or puncturing of used oil filters. You may also manipulate the anti-drain back valve on the filter itself to ensure that all of the oil is emptied from the filter. And you can see a little diagram with the used oil filter and showing where the drain back valve is. Here you can see examples of uncased oil filters that aren't eligible to be sent for metals recycling. These filters must not be commingled with the metal case filters and instead must be managed as a hazardous waste. And just as a bonus note, if you can see what's wrong with the pictures above, the container is open even though nothing is being added or removed. And also the label is missing all of the required information. It's missing the name, address of the generator. It's missing the words hazardous waste, accumulation start date, etc. Universal wastes are another classification of waste that have alternate labeling requirements. Universal wastes are waste that almost all businesses will produce, and they are specifically defined in regulation. Examples of universal waste include your typical alkaline batteries, so think AA, AAA, C, or D, or the 9-volt batteries. Fluorescent lights, so think those twisty, energy efficient light bulbs that you'll see. Aerosol cans, and then some mercury containing items, such as mercury switches on old thermostats, for example. These wastes need to be labeled as universal waste with the type of universal waste listed. So for example, the label could say universal waste batteries and the accumulation start date. An example of some universal waste labels are shown here. Other types of universal wastes are electronic devices. Think of electronics that have circuit boards in them. and cathode ray tubes. These are usually found in those old school computer monitors and television, so you can think of those large boxy monitors like the ones in the second and third pictures on the slide. These need to be labeled as well, but you can designate a storage area or pallet and mark the entire area instead of each individual device with the universal waste label. Empty containers have different requirements based on how large the empty container is. If it's larger than 5 gallons, it must be marked with the date that the container was emptied. Although not required by hazardous waste regulations, many local fire codes will also require that empty containers that previously held a hazardous material or waste be marked with the words empty. A good practice in order to satisfy your local fire agency and your hazardous waste inspector is to mark all empty hazardous waste containers larger than 5 gallons with both. An empty container is defined as a container that has no pourable or scrapable material in the container. And we'll go over that a little bit more in depth on the next slide. As I mentioned in the previous slide, the definition of an empty container in California hazardous waste regulations is a container that does not have any pourable or scrapable material remaining. Here, you can see an example of two non-empty containers. In the container on the left, there's still some material that could be scraped out. And for the container on the right, you can see that there is still some pourable liquid inside of that container. If your container is empty of pourable or scrapable material and is less than 5 gallons in size, you may dispose of it in your normal trash or recycling. If your empty container is larger than 5 gallons, such as a steel drum, it must be sent for reconditioning, it must be reclaimed for scrap value, or it must be remanufactured or refilled. These would not be able to go into the normal trash or recycling. The next common type of waste with exceptions to the rules are reusable soiled textile materials. Basically, these are shop towels, uniforms, linens, or other launderable material that have been contaminated with hazardous wastes. Instead of sending these materials to a disposal facility like your other hazardous wastes, you may instead send these to a commercial laundry if you meet certain criteria. So 1, the rags or textile materials must not have been used to control spills. Now, wiping up small drips and dribbles is usually fine. 2, no hazardous waste added after the original use. So you can't dump your used oil into your dirty shop rags instead of accumulating it into your waste drums. No free liquids should be released during storage. So that is, the rags can't be dripping liquids when they're being stored. And 4, the commercial laundry has a contingency plan and maintains records on the materials that are laundered. If you're not sure if your commercial laundry meets this criteria, just ask. If all of the criteria are met, you are exempt from certain hazardous waste regulations, such as the requirement to ship hazardous waste on a manifest. We'll go over shipping documents in the next section. Lastly, let's talk a little bit about lead acid batteries. Lead acid batteries normally are contained by the plastic casing. However, if the battery is damaged such that it could leak electrolyte, or if it's missing a cap, then there are requirements to ensure that there are no releases of hazardous waste from the damaged battery. All damaged lead acid batteries should be placed in a container that can control the release, and the initial date of accumulation must be marked on the container that is holding these batteries. Write the date in ink, paint, or some other weather-resistant material so that the date doesn't wash off and is legible and conspicuous for an inspection. Now that we've covered some of the common waste streams with exceptions to the rules, does anyone have any questions regarding these waste streams?